aliens! Let me start this video off by telling you all once again how much I love Breath of the Wild. I know it's silly, but whenever I talk critically on this game, I know some people will always think that I just don't like the game. But no, I love the game, and it's because I love the game that I criticize it on things that I think were a little bit underdeveloped that I just maybe would have liked to see more of. And today is something I am very passionate about when it comes to Zelda games. For a series so highly centered around fantasy, the series, even right at the beginning, never really fell into having classic fantasy monsters, and instead made up a lot of its own, some of which were based off of those classic monsters seen in bits of fantasy media, but for the most part, Hyrule and all other worlds within the Zelda series are full of unique and interesting monsters. So many monsters in the Zelda series have become well known and recognisable, whether it's because they've been used in many games, because of how strange they look, or because they scared the Korok seeds out of us when we were children. I'm looking at you, Dead Hand. This is something that I've always loved about the Zelda series. They have such an amazing lineup of monsters and enemies that they have made over the years, from all of these different games. Some monsters may only show up in one game and then are never used again, but many are brought back time and time again and changed to make them more interesting for newer games. But sadly, when we get to the newest entry in the series, Breath of the Wild, I feel the amount of monsters in this game was very underwhelming and a little lackluster. With a list of so many monsters from so many games spanning almost 35 years, they had so much to choose from, but Breath of the Wild's monster lineup just kind of fell short. And as I'm such a big fan of the enemies in this series, it wasn't long into my first time playing Breath of the Wild when I realised that I was fighting the same monsters over and over again. Now, sometimes I did explore more and did come across something new, mainly the overworld mini-bosses. I remember finding my first Hinox and freaking out as I had nothing to fight it with, and now this giant Cyclops was chasing me down. Or the first time I found a Lynel, high up on the mountains around Zora's domain. Apart from overworld bosses though, not many normal monsters in the game surprised me. I think the only normal monster that did was the treasure chest Octorok, and that's just because it scared me when it jumped out of the sand and hit Link in the face. Some of you may think I'm overreacting and that there was a perfect amount of variety in the monsters, and that's fine if you do. For me though, the cast of enemies in this game just felt small, and after a little research, I realised why. So let's name off and count all of the monsters in Breath of the Wild. I'll be excluding bosses and different variants of the same monster like Keese and Fire Keese. They'll just be counted as one monster type. I will also be counting the overworld mini-bosses, as there is a handful of them across the map and I just want to. So these are all of the enemies in Breath of the Wild, once again excluding bosses and variants of the same enemy type. Bokoblins, Moblins, Lizalfos, Wizrobes, Lynels, Choo-Choos, Style Monsters, Cursed Enemies, Keese, Guardians, Octoroks, Peblets, Yiga Soldiers, Hinox, Stalnox, Molduga, and the Stone Taluses. Now again, we do have variants like fire, ice and electricity types of enemies like Keese and Choo-Choos, and different coloured enemies like the Moblins and Bokoblins, showing they have different health. But those little changes honestly are not big enough for me to count them as different enemies. Altogether though, that is 17 enemy types. A amount what may not seem that bad for some people and seem like a pretty decent cast. But that's when my research comes in and really puts home how small this cast is. Let's look at the amount of enemies in a couple of other Zelda games. First off, we'll start with probably the second biggest Zelda game after Breath of the Wild, Twilight Princess. This game has over 50 enemy types. Again, for this game and the next games I'll be mentioning, I did not count bosses and variants of the same enemies. Even with that though, this game still has well over 50 different enemy types. Ocarina of Time, the first 3D Zelda game, had over 30 enemy types. Phantom Hourglass, a much smaller game than Breath of the Wild, and even Ocarina of Time, has over 30. And to finish this off, the original Legend of Zelda game on the NES has a little over 20 different enemy types. All of those games vary in size but are still much smaller games compared to Breath of the Wild. And all of them, from Twilight Princess being the second biggest Zelda game to the original all the way back on the NES, have more monsters and more different types of monsters than Breath of the Wild. And I think that's my big problem. Breath of the Wild is the biggest Zelda game at the moment. Its overworld is huge and it's amazing. I still get lost in the world and find new locations that I didn't find before, no matter how many hours I've put into the game. But with a world that big, I think it really shows how little variety there is in the monsters. Along with that, many of the monsters that you find all over Hyrule, being Bokoblins, Moblins and Lizalfos, all act very similar. Lizalfos have a little bit more to them as they can swim and sometimes do have elemental abilities, but the three of them are all very simple monsters, and you find them all over Hyrule. Now, I know it's just a game and I know it isn't real, but I find it hard to believe that Link has to wear this giant suit of armour up on Death Mountain, but these half-naked Bokoblins are perfectly fine and somehow not catching on fire. The same goes for up in the Snowy Mountains. We can actually find Moblins and Bokoblins frozen in blocks of ice up in the Gerudo Highlands and Hairborough Mountains, kind of adding to my thought that they just don't belong up there. In past games, monsters all had designated areas. For example, in Ocarina of Time, you only really found Moblins in the Sacred Forest Meadow as an adult. In Twilight Princess, Bokoblins were found mostly in places like Faron Woods and the Forest Temple, but could be found at times out in Hyrule Field. You did not find these monsters in places like Snow Peak and Death Mountain. It just doesn't make sense to have monsters like them in places like that. As Breath of the Wild has such a small cast of monsters, they placed them all over Hyrule and just changed the elemental type to fit their surroundings. What would have been better in my eyes was keeping the different types but making them less common, and adding in new monsters for those different locations like the mountains and the volcanoes, that could only be found in those locations. This is actually something I started thinking about when I was playing the game for the first time. It took me a while to make my way to all of the different locations, but I remember as I was making my way to Death Mountain, I thought to myself, wondering if I would see monsters like the Dongos or Dead Rocks. And when I was making my way to the Hairborough region, I thought about Freezards and Chilphos. And I distinctly remember thinking to myself what could be in Hyrule Castle. As the final dungeon of the game, I really held myself back from exploring it until I was ready to finish the game. And by this time, I was really excited. I thought there must be something new, a monster that was in that one place. It was the final dungeon of the game. It didn't feel so crazy to think that. I really did think how cool it would have been for that one location to have a new monster, just for that one place. Maybe a Darknut, an enemy which has become pretty common to find in final dungeons of the Zelda series. But nope. Sadly, it was just Moblins, Bokoblins, Lizalfos, a ton of Guardians outside, and the occasional Liner also outside. The only place in Breath of the Wild which kinda had this enemy designated to a certain area feel was the desert, and that's really only because the Molduga was found in this area. And honestly, it was so cool finding that monster and fighting it in the desert. After all of the repeating enemies, it was so much fun and really exciting to find something different and new that was only in this one place. I really wish there was more of that in this game. As Breath of the Wild is such a big game, I think it feels so strange to be walking around this beautiful and expansive world, but always seeing the same monsters you saw in a completely different region. I said at the start of this video how many different types of monsters there are in the Zelda series, so there was plenty to choose from. We could have seen Dekubabas and Skulltulas, which would have fit perfectly in the Faron woods. The Dongos, a classic monster going all the way back to the original Legend of Zelda game, would have been an amazing enemy to see up on Death Mountain. Moldworms and levers would have fit perfectly into the Gerudo Desert alongside the Molduga. For enemies that could be found in a couple of different locations, you could have Tektites, which could be found in Hyrule Field or by lakes and rivers. Bubbles could have been found all over Hyrule, maybe disguising themselves around other skulls of animals and monsters, or even turn up only at night. We have normal wolves in Breath of the Wild, but maybe up in the mountains or deep within the forest, there are Wolfos. These could be much larger than the standard wolves, and look much more monstrous, standing on their back legs and towering over Link. And as I mentioned before, Darknuts would have been perfect for Hyrule Castle as a final challenge before getting to Calamity Ganon. There are so many different types of monsters which could have been used all over Hyrule, and it's kind of a shame that for a game the size of Breath of the Wild, in a series that has so many classic monsters, so many were left out. With Breath of the Wild sequel on the horizon, I really hope that Nintendo bring back more classic enemies and even give us some new ones. The Guardians were an amazing new monster for the series and have already become a fan favourite, so I'd love to see what they could do with even more new monsters for this new game. No matter what though, if they give us new monsters or bring back old ones, I just hope that they give us a little bit more to make this world feel even more alive and have a more diverse cast of enemies. Hey Hylians! Thank you all for watching today's video. I don't think I've really done a video heavily criticising a Zelda game before, so I have been a little bit nervous on how people will react to my opinion. But it's something that I've been thinking about since the game came out, and I just really needed to finally get my thoughts out into a video. I'm wondering how you guys think of the enemies in Breath of the Wild. Do you think there's the perfect amount, or do you think we needed more? Do you think we could have swapped out some of the enemies in Breath of the Wild with a couple of different enemies? Tell me all your thoughts down below, and hey, why not tell me some enemies that you would like to see in Breath of the Wild sequel? I'm actually thinking about making another video just talking about monsters I'd like to see in that game, so it'd be fun to see what kind of monsters you'd like to see return. Thank you all again for watching, I hope you've all enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye!